So I really wanted to give just a really quick sketch of saying, it's like, what do we mean by this thing, adult development, and really just begin to look at what it points to. And I also will maybe just acknowledge right from the outset that there's different approaches to understanding the phenomena of human development, an endless number actually. And we are going to be drawing from a few particular models, and we'll be sharing a much more about that. So this is more just a little bit of kind of context setting for why we're even beginning to, look at how consciousness can shape and inform and affect our work in the world, and particularly climate work. So these are just, a couple images to point to the idea that we can work at the level of behaviors, we can work at the level of systems change, at the level of cultural change, and we need all of that. And deeper than that, even is the ways in which we're making meaning of the world, our mental models. And then even deeper than that is actually transcending those paradigms. So people might be aware of Donella Meadows' work, who was looking at leverage points for change in systems. And initially, the deepest leverage point that she pointed to was at the level of mental models. And then she later added on transcending those models altogether so that we can be free of the ways that we're limited by them, but also work well across them. So this is just to point to the possibility that working at the level of consciousness has that potential of a deeper leverage for transformative change. So, when I think about what does it mean to not integrate interiors in our change work in the world, sometimes it can feel like we're pushing against an immovable object. And so this is just to evoke that quality. So in thinking about in climate work, typically, traditionally, there's been a little bit more of a focus on behavior change and systems change, bringing in new technologies and so forth. And that's all so important. And there's other aspects of the human experience to bring to bear on supporting that change. And so that's where opening up this area of human interiors for individuals and collectives, both the developmental dimensions of individuals as well as cultural aspects, can really help to liberate some of those change efforts potentially. So this is drawing from the integral model, and I'm only going to very briefly just reference these are the 4 quadrants of the integral model, and it's pointing again to this idea that so when we're working on change, we can draw on these 4 different areas: behavioral change, systems change, cultural change, and psychological dimensions of change work, mindsets, worldviews, values, and so forth. We don't have to draw on all 4, but it's helpful and important to be aware that there's important contributions from each of these areas that we can bring to bear if it serves the work that we're doing. And choosing to focus in one area to the exclusion of the others is often doesn't lead to the kind of change that we're hoping to have. So just another way of articulating the potential value of bringing in insights from developmental psychology. So in climate work, there's an increasing emphasis on engaging human interiors in our work. And so, you can see this in some of these books that have come out in the last, just some very recently, as in this year, and others within the last decade. So there's an increasing recognition of, wow, there's important understanding that we can bring to understanding why change is happening and why change isn't happening. And so these book images just point to some of the work that is happening in those territories. Just to say a touch about adult development. So what we're talking about here is, it's not as much about the what of what people believe, but more the why of why they believe it. So these are deeper structures that shape how we make meaning of the world. And because they're deeper structures, it makes it sort of a subtle and relatively complex thing to learn about. And we do feel like it's worth the effort, and it is actually sometimes quite a shift in our orientation, but it's really about the lens through which we see the world. And beginning to understand adult development it can support compassion for self and others, deeper understanding of self and others, and also point to ways to bridge differences. Couple things that I was thinking about in this is, it's possible that the very pressures of the issues that we're facing at a global scale, planetary scale, are the things that are actually going to help grow us up to be sufficient for the challenges that we're facing. And so if we really let these, complex, wicked, hyper-object problems solve us rather than us solve them, then we become who we need to be individually and collectively to begin to address climate change. And so that to me speaks of developmental humility. It's, when I first learned about adult development, I was so excited about it because I thought, okay, here's the tool that I've been looking for to go out and transform others. And yes, there is a dimension to which it can help us understand how to work well with and potentially create transformation with others. But actually, it ultimately brought me back to myself in terms of understanding more about how I was seeing and approaching my work in the world, and whether I was doing that in a way that actually created mutual positive regard, which I think is ultimately much more effective at helping to join with others to create change rather than sort of pushing on others or pushing on the world. It's another thing that adult development can point to is recognizing these patterns of growth and development in ourselves. One is that we've never arrived, we're always engaged in the process, and two, that we can actually turn the sort of the view back to ourselves to see, how am I approaching this work, where am I sourcing it from, and how might my own ways of being and doing affect how I'm engaging with others. So at the most simple level, I think about it as widening circles of identity, care, and responsibility. As we grow and mature through life, who we take ourselves to be, who we include in our circle of identity, and also what we feel a sense of responsibility for can widen and deepen over time. And so, if we think about where a baby is born, actually not separate from, their parents and the world, start to separate out as a separate sense of self, but be very focused on the I, me, and mine. And then there's a wider circle of the we, but that we might be very close to home, my own family, my own people, as I perceive it. And there is this possibility of these circles continuing to deepen and widen as we move through the developmental process. So just to start to get into the concepts, what we're looking at here is the interplay between interior development and systems change work, and recognizing that the two are never separate. And we're just wanting to highlight that, that relationship, as well as focus a little bit on the interior development side to understand, why this matters in climate work. So we're looking at the interplay between the two. And this is an image from Theory U. Some of you might be familiar with it, but what we're looking at here is starting to look at these, these sort of the deeper dimensions that inform our behaviors, that inform the structures that we create in society, that have some of the symptoms, expressed as symptoms around ecological, social, spiritual divide issues. So we're attempting to look at the deeper source that gives rise to the phenomena of climate change and the challenges that we're currently facing. So a quote from Otto Scharmer, who is one of the founders, the source of the Theory U process, is, to transform systems, we need to transform consciousness. And so in Theory U, they talk about awareness-based systems change. And I wanted to add something to that, which is, to create transformative change, it also helps to be aware of the patterns of consciousness development. So yes, it's likely that to transform systems, we need to transform consciousness, and the work of consciousness transformation is slow work, and sometimes it actually may be, it may be more effective to not seek to so much to not put all of our attention on transforming consciousness, but actually also to just understand the phenomena of consciousness development so we can work well with and across differences. So a little bit of a both and there, both the transformation as well as just being aware of the patterns of this development and how to work with that. So this set of these set of words and images relates to the simple idea that climate change is a really complex phenomena, and we need to and will be suited by having our own interior complexity grow and mature to be able to, effectively begin to engage with and address this very complex phenomena. That without that a match on our own, at the level of our own meaning making, we're insufficient to this challenge. And, this is drawing from some of Robert Keegan's insights, a developmental researcher, saying that it may be that we humans don't quite solve climate change, but that climate change solves us. In other words, it grows us up to who we need to be to begin to engage with these issues. And that's that's also that recognition that we're not separate from this planet and the cosmos that we're living in and from and engaging with. We're actually a part of it. And so there may be some way in which, these issues that we're facing, that we've contributed to, are also the phenomena that help to ultimately help us grow up, and also, help us in our own pathway of liberation, growth, and development. So that what got us here isn't what's going to help us, solve these issues to create the future we want. Self, culture, systems, and society must evolve. So just to recognize that for people that are developmentally informed already, and those that are new to development, there's lots of different ways that development can be studied. Everything from different cultural cosmologies, spiritual teachings and wisdom traditions, to the phenomena of human psychology. And so, so I just wanted to speak very briefly to, there's many different lenses on the developmental phenomena. The intention here is not to get really deep into the theory itself, but to focus on how can this be useful? How can we make use of it? So it's going to be more about application than going deep into theory. And I do know that there's people who are part of this series who are more well-versed in some of the other developmental models that are represented here. And again, it'll be really fascinating to look at, how do these different developmental lenses, what do each of them bring forward that the other one might obscure? So it'll be interesting to see how they can complement one another. And then the other thing to recognize too is that we're going to be looking more so at the development of individuals, and that's how these models, these theories arose, is looking at the patterns of how humans develop over time in their lives. But we're also, this is, development also happens and needs to happen in the territory of culture, of groups, of organizations and systems. And so we're not leaving that out, but we are focusing the lens a little bit more so on looking at the development of the individual. But there's patterns that apply across all those territories, and we'll be touching on them at different times. So we'll take another handful of minutes to look at some foundational concepts. The most basic definition that I like to work with around what do we mean by this adult developmental phenomena is the widening circles of identity, care, and responsibility. That as we grow and change throughout our lives, our circles of care, our circles of who we take ourselves to be and who we include in that, and also our sense of responsibility for a larger whole, continues to widen and deepen over time. And, I think one of the phenomena here that feels important is recognizing that those who can embrace a larger aspect of, let's say, the complexity of climate change, ultimately then also hold more responsibility for the ways that we're, engaging and acting around these issues. If we can see more, then it actually gives us some additional responsibility to include more, and to also bring an ethic of care and responsibility, respect, appreciation for the differences that others have to our work. So it's we get this expanding capacity, but we also get an expanding responsibility or respondability. So just another way of looking at it more simply is just these widening circles of this is a sort of scope of care that, early in life, it's I, me, and mine, and then it's a we, but it's a particular we. So it's my community, and everybody else might be considered another. And then that embrace gets wider and deeper. through the developmental process. It's also about perspective taking. So it's through which lens am I seeing the world, and can I embrace more perspectives? And that's something that's seen in the developmental phenomena, is that there's an increasing capacity to take perspectives other than just our own. And that's part of this phenomena of a widening circle of identity. So, you know, of course, you know, my own sense of identity is, you know, Abigail through this human form, and as my own sense of whose views and perspectives can I begin to care for, and also begin to imagine what it might be like to live life through this other, you know, this other human or other animal life form experience. So expanding capacities to take increasing perspectives. So what do we mean by adult development? We're talking about it's a form of internal systems thinking. So we have a systems thinking to understand the complex phenomena of how, you know, things happen in the world. And we also, this is a form of internal systems thinking. So understanding what are some of the systems inside of us that shape how we understand and experience life. The research finds that we move through relatively stable stages of development, and that this can and does continue through adulthood. And that each of these stages or phases of development represent a significant shift in how we experience ourselves in the world. So it's called, you know, in Kegan's work, it's called a qualitative shift of meaning making. So who we are and how we saw the world is quite significantly different from one of these phases to the next. Through the developmental process, so this relates to those widening circles, increasing level of autonomy, freedom, perspective taking capacity, self and other awareness, metacognition, sense of inclusivity and adaptability in interacting with others in the environment. So I imagine that you can see in these changing capacities through the developmental process that there's some significant implications for climate work. And also the recognition, and each stage has gifts and blind spots, and all are inherently and fundamentally worthy of respect. So we're talking about here, you know, we could talk about it as a nested hierarchy rather than a dominator hierarchy. So what we're saying here, and the next slide addresses this a little bit, is that later stages, more mature stages, have capacities that the earlier stages don't have, but they're not inherently more worthy of respect than the earlier stages. So these are some of the paradoxes of development. The ethical intent of working with development is to understand and serve human flourishing and liberation. It's a spectrum of compassion. So that's the intent of, you know, of the application of these frameworks. But we also know that hierarchies have been used historically, and have been used historically to limit, devalue, and oppress others. And so there's a degree to which any tool is, you know, how we use a tool is shaped by the consciousness of the person holding the tool. And so here there's a really clear and deeply committed ethical intent for liberation. But it also is possible to say, oh, you know, to put somebody into a box and say, oh, well, they're just earlier developmentally, and, you know, what they have to say isn't relevant or isn't making a valuable contribution. And so we'll be working with this paradox throughout our time together, because it's if we're using it to limit and to, you know, to dismiss others, then it's not being used with the ethical intent that's beneath and behind these models. So we'll be working with that tension throughout, and also noticing it in ourselves, is just in what ways do I dismiss certain views and values in the world, and how can I actually bring more curiosity, more humility, more wonder to the difference that this other human is representing. Even if I'm not going to take the view that they're holding, I can still seek to understand and join a little bit for the sake of the larger goal, which is, you know, more equity, justice, and flourishing of all life on the planet. Just to recognize too that we're talking about a map here, and it's also to acknowledge that, all theories are limited in their views, right? So they get something and they miss something. So we're looking for what's the value here and looking to minimize what it's missing, but also be conscious of what it's missing. And so one of the limitations here is that adult development research primarily draws from Western psychological theory and research. So it's not to hide that fact, it's just to be conscious of it. So there's something potentially of value here, and there's also something limited from in terms of looking at cultural perspectives. And so our invitation is to pay attention to what these frameworks liberate and to minimize what they limit. And it's an encouragement that I'd hope for everybody is to always notice, does this tool liberate more than it limits? And if it does, then make use of it. If it doesn't, let it go. So the intention here is to hold these tools lightly, but to notice and to work with what they make possible, and let them go, let them fade to the background, or let them go altogether if it feels like they're not bringing more love, justice, insight to the world. And there's what I just said right there. Does it bring more intimacy, curiosity, care, and understanding? Like, what happens when we don't have a developmental perspective? And even when we do have a developmental perspective, we often get culture wars between the different developmental ways of making meaning. And so this is just to acknowledge, in the absence of recognizing some of the developmental patterns that shape some of the ways that we can polarize from one another. This is just to highlight that. And learning about development doesn't, of course, remove those patterns of polarization, but it gives us some skills and tools for navigating them. And I know that we're all abundantly conscious of the profound polarization that's happening both within the US but also nationally around our different views and values. So and something to pay attention to and recognize is that not conscious of developmental patterns and how they shape some of this phenomena can actually being unconscious of it, we can be more unwittingly contributing to those polarization dynamics. More conscious of developmental patterns can give us some pathways out of the polarization. So it's a place to get started with. So we're going to look at a few developmental patterns and then look at some examples of how these different meaning-making structures relate to the phenomena of social and ecological change work. So this is just to highlight how it is relevant to climate work. So one of the patterns that's really significant and plays a big role in polarity dynamics is our thinking patterns. So we see in these different stages of development that there's a progression in thinking patterns from only being able to see one side of an issue to starting to be able to recognize, oh, there's two different sides to this issue. At the achiever stage, there's the either or view, but I'm still going to choose the one that I prefer. Moving into the pluralist stage of development, there's a capacity to work with the both and. So to say this is important and this is important. And at the strategist stage of development is starting to engage with recognizing how these are two sides of the same coin, they're one within the other. So an example of this could be around the question of, what kind of change is important? Is it systems change or is it personal transformation? You can get into quite a debate with people around that topic. And from an expert stage of development, you'd only see one of those options. From the achiever, you choose, you can see that there's two options. Is it inner change or outer change? Well, it's one or the other, and I'm going to pick my favorite. At the pluralist, oh, both have value, and let's just bring both into the picture. And then the strategist recognizing that actually one shapes the other and vice versa. So thinking, our capacities to engage in more nuanced and complex thinking changes with these developmental patterns. And so, an example of this that I saw not so long ago in the world was there was a sign that I passed on a community on a church, and it said, "We offer black and white in a world of gray." So the recognition that, this particular community is going to help you see the world in more black and white terms, more simple terms, more ways of, not getting confused in the multiplicity of perspectives that could be overwhelming if you don't yet have those capacities. Another pattern is, well, there's two here. There's both the time horizon and systems thinking. So this is where you can start to think about those widening circles. Our time horizon changes as we grow developmentally. So, so here I've brought in 5 different developmental stages, starting from one that is, I'm just going to give a really loose age. So stages of development are not tied in a significant way to age, but there are some age patterns. So at the conformist stage of development often occurs in late adolescence, and there are adults that can live their life in this stage of development. So, so it's from late adolescence through adulthood. And at the conformist stage of development, the time horizon is the present moment and looking to the past. So it's more of a traditional worldview. So for instance, when you're looking to understand weather patterns and how they change, we would look to the past to see what had happened before to be able to predict the future. At the next stage of development, the time horizon stretches out a little bit further, so you can start to see months into the future, then the next one 5 years, then start to see generationally. And then I'll add to that the systems thinking that arises also out of each of these stages of development. At that earlier stage, the conformist, things are seen more in their parts, not in the relationships between the parts, more atomistically. So for instance, with something like climate change, you might see that, might see changes in weather patterns, but not see how that's connected to the systems and structures that are contributing to those changes in the first place, and not understand how it's all related and connected. And then through each of these stages, there's an increasing capacity to engage with and recognize the understanding of, more complex systems dynamics. So here, just to make a really quick and simple example, it's at the pluralist stage of development where there's a greater capacity to engage with an understanding of the complexity of the phenomena of climate change. And so if we recognize that, and recognize that at the prior stages, of which there's many adults who live their lives in all of these stages, but in the prior stages, there's not yet the capacity to recognize the complexity of the issue. And so in not recognizing the complexity of the issue means that the solutions that will be proposed from those prior stages of development might be seen by somebody at pluralist as too simplistic, too individually oriented, not including a systems analysis. So this is a really significant pattern that that applies to climate work. And then again at the next, the strategist stage of development, there's an even wider time scale that's recognized, multi-generational, as well as an insight into an ability to start to work with systems of systems. And so this is quite abstract, and we'll be making it more kind of concrete and applied. As we were talking before, development also includes perspective taking. And that really affects our ability to understand perspectives other than our own, to have empathy and compassion, and to be able to work well with some of those differences. So at the second person perspective, that's basically a you and I. It's where you start to, if you think about it, as a child is developing, they start off in a first person perspective. They don't recognize that they're separate from their mother. They're in the I perspective. The world is, experienced as just only from their own perspective. At the second person perspective, we start to recognize that there's another that we can be in relationship with, that you can negotiate with, to divide up resources or toys, that kind of a thing. And it's an early capacity to start to see that somebody actually is different than you, sees the world differently. So there's the second person perspective, then the third person perspective, which brings in the rational objective mind, fourth person perspective, which brings in context awareness, subjectivity, and a recognition of complex systems. This is, again, really significant for climate change work, because as we were talking about the systems element of being able to begin to understand more complex systems, and also to recognize how systems shape who we are. So that's the context awareness. So to recognize that I grew up in a certain cultural context and it shapes who I am and how I am in the world, what I see and what I don't see, where my blind spots are and so forth. And so there's a deeper understanding of these interior dynamics as well as the exterior dynamics in terms of systems. And then that continues developmentally into the fifth person perspective and the sixth person beyond. So I want to just give a couple examples of how this can show up in actual meaning making. So this is a sentence stem. We could make the world a better place if, that's actually used in understanding some of these sentence stem assessments are used in understanding some of these developmental patterns. And here's a sentence stem that relates to the territory of the work that we're all in here together. And these are actual responses to the sentence stem that reflect some of the patterns of each of these stages. So here's the first 5 stages, and then we'll look at some additional ones later. But starting with the conformist, which is the second person perspective, the response is we could make the world a better place if we stop polluting. And I'm just going to read through these and then talk about a couple patterns. At the expert stage of development, recognition of if we could make the world a better place if science literacy was a priority. So that really reflects the rational mind and also wanting to get hard data and metrics to inform us about these issues, but not seeing beyond that yet. The next one, we could make the world a better place if everyone took responsibility for their own actions and focused less on material achievements. So the focus here is still a little bit on the individual and also an awareness of kind of material excesses. Expert and achiever are third person perspective. Fourth person perspective is the pluralist and strategist. So again, that's context awareness and a capacity to begin to engage with complex adaptive systems. We could make the world a better place if we spent more time thinking about the wider implications of our actions on others and on the planet. So a much wider awareness of concerns about others as well as the planet as a whole. If as a human race, we were able to have greater empathy for others, including animals and the environment, so all of life, and we're able to put our own personal gratification to one side for the greater good. So a recognition of orienting towards a greater good, that we can kind of put our own needs and desires to some extent aside for this greater purpose. And then the strategist, we could make the world a better place if we don't go for simple solutions, but really try to understand on every level what the problems of today are and create community around certain themes such as climate change, racial or religious tension, and try from that community to create different or multiple ways of seeing and communicating. So it's at the strategist stage of development where there actually tends to be a recognition of these internal systems, of meaning making that we're talking about here, and the importance of coordinating across those for deeper systemic change. I'll just highlight these really briefly. So this is getting into the fifth and sixth person perspective, and I'm going to read just the construct aware one. We could make the world a better place if, my biggest concern about climate change is that maybe climate change is too limiting a lens, too narrow a construct to bring forth what is possible, needed from the species at this moment in history. Perhaps we should think of a nexus of climate, nuclear weapons, geopolitical unrest, corruption, economic volatility, epistemic failure, biotechnology, AI, sexism, racism, and who knows what else that we can't even discern or understand as the defining crisis of our age. So seeing connections and non-separation between all of these different issues, and how if we actually start to shift the frames that we're using, we actually may have a better chance of solving these issues in a deeper way.